Hi everyone! So this is a quick recipe on how to make baklava. Well, my way at least. And I'm gonna try to basically go through the techniques and everything that you need to make this dessert. So for the filling part, and you need a phyllo dough. I use Krinos, but basically the idea is that you buy a package which has about 16 to 18 pieces in it. You need a pound to half a kilo of nuts. I use half a kilo of walnuts. You can use other types of nuts. Pistachios are obviously I would say some people prefer them. They're much more expensive. So quite often I just use walnuts because they're pretty good as well. You need half a pack of butter, or half a pound of butter basically. That has to be melted, and teaspoon to teaspoon and a half, I like a bit more, so a teaspoon and a half of cinnamon. So what needs to be done, and that's for like the baking portion. For the syrup, I use half a cup of honey, and I already put it in a pot, so don't have to transfer too many times. I use 1 cup of sugar and 1 cup of water. This optionally you can put rose water or vanilla. I like to put rose water. A teaspoon is usually sufficient. Now in terms of tools, what you need is a 9 by 13 inch baking pan. I line it with foil. The purpose for that is to make sure that if you do get accidentally, it gets accidentally burned, you don't have to basically throw out the whole pan. So a bit of that. And second, when we cut them, you prevent your pan from being damaged. You need a tablespoon for spreading the nuts, a silicone brush or something like that for spreading butter onto the phyllo dough, and a rolling pin, which is not really a rolling pin, it's actually just a pin on which you're gonna roll on the actual baklava. This is about 2 feet by about a centimeter, something around a centimeter, and it has to be fairly thin, so, well, you'll see why. You need a knife, obviously the pan for making a sauce, and a cutting board to chop up the nuts. So the first thing that needs to be done is the butter has to be fully melted, and I usually do it in microwave about a minute and a half, depending on how powerful you use your microwave, and make sure to cover it so butter doesn't explode inside. And you need to chop up the nuts. It's not that's probably the longest time that you will spend in terms of all this preparation, is just chopping up the nuts. So not to waste too much time, through a magic of time travel, I'm gonna get this prepared and we'll come back to continue actually assembling everything together. Alright. Okay, so the nuts have been chopped. It's they're about this consistency. It's not too small, not too large. I would say do it by hand, even though it takes a little bit of time. But the point is, when you do it by hand, you don't end up. For example, if you do it in a chopper, it will be very uneven, and it won't come out as a fairly consistent result. So that's why I do it by hand. We add the cinnamon, and we toss it to make sure it's well incorporated in the nuts. So make sure that's done, and then it becomes fairly, I would say, tedious process, but it's not too complicated. So one note about a phyllo dough: make sure that if you buy it in a store, and if it was in a freezer, you let it stay in a fridge a little bit, a few hours or so, and then take it out on the counter to make sure it doesn't break and crack. Now, It sometimes varies and even breaks and cracks. It's not a huge problem, but it makes your life significantly simpler. So you see I've unrolled it fairly easily, but I do have about a few sheets that are on the corner are sticking to each other, because this is a very, very thin and delicate dough. It's much nicer when it's not dried up and cracking. In a lot of recipes what they say is that you have to cover it all the time and to make sure that it doesn't dry up with covered with damp towel. I don't do that because I just work faster on it and it doesn't get a chance. So what you do is you basically brush butter on the layers, and you might run out of butter. I usually don't, but in some cases I do, and just melt a little bit more, and it's usually very little, like a tablespoon or so. That's not a big deal. So you brush butter onto the sheet, and what you do is you use 2 sheets at a time. So you, by unrolling it, you don't really have to handle it at all, which is why it's also fairly easy and you don't have to cut it. Let me just check what's the general width of the size of the sheet is. Okay. So my sheet that I'm using is about 43 centimeters by about 33 centimeters. So when you spread the butter, and it covers basically the whole sheet, then you start spreading nuts. And you want to get a general coverage. Usually it's about 3 to 4 tablespoons, depending how big your tablespoon is. But you will get an idea looking at how I'm making it right now. So a third one, just so it has a full. It doesn't have to be super precise, as long as it, it's not too dense, but it covers everything. So we get something like that. This is reasonable. Maybe a little bit on the edges, so they're not too dry with just dough. And then you place the rolling pin. Get 2 sheets, basically separate, just to make sure there's only 2 sheets. One sheet will be way too thin, and 2 sheets and 3 sheets is way too thick. So there's a little bit of work involved in trying to be careful not to rip them apart. But when you get that, you start rolling like that. So when you roll it, you get a fairly thin roll like such, and you squeeze it a little bit. Don't squeeze it too much. Squeeze it a little bit so it just holds together. And then that's the sort of the scariest part, is that you squeeze it like that to about the width of your pan, and lower it in here. Now, see, I didn't do it fully, so you can still wiggle it in to make sure it fits into your pan. And you adjust, depending on, basically as you go. So something like that, and you can imagine this fills up with 8 to 9 rolls, depending on how many sheets you get. I know that I have about usually it's about 18-19 sheets, so I'm not even bothering to count. Let's just say I made a few of them before with this specific dough, and I generally try to stick with the same dough, because you don't have to figure out how to measure how many spoons of nuts you need to spread. So same approach, very simple. Spread the butter and repeat until you're done. So what I'm going to do, I'm probably going to show you this still in normal speed, and afterwards I'll speed this whole process up to show that it's really not a big deal, and plus you don't really need to see me do it the whole way through. So again, grab 2 sheets, something like that, a little bit of a squeeze. Let's make it a little bit more. And goes in, and we're done here. So the following process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to speed up so it's not too boring. So we're basically at the end of the rolling stage of all of the baklava. As you saw, I did run out a little bit of nuts, and that's okay. More nuts better than less nuts, I guess. And it seems that, as I predicted, I did have 19 sheets, so that's why I have 9 rolls and 1 sheet remaining. To keep consistency, I will not use it. You can make a little one on the side, but to be honest, I wouldn't bother. So this can, be kept for future if you're making a bunch of them, but that's up to you. I just say that. So the next step, and it's very important, is to make sure that you cut the baklava before you actually bake it, because cutting it after baking would be problematic since it will be already kind of crunchy and will fall apart. So there are several ways of cutting it. You can cut it in 6 pieces, which is what I'm going to do. You can cut it in 4 or 5, but less than that, the baklava I think will become a bit large. 6 pieces is a nice sort of bite size, so that's why I usually use that. And first I do a cut which is not all the way to the end, and then the second cut to make sure it fully separates. You can use a ruler to be very precise if you're making it for, I don't know, some sort of a function or a party, or you can be a little bit of like, yeah, this is what it's good enough kind of thing. So the next step is preheat. Well, you should preheat your oven before. I didn't do it right now because it will be way too loud to talk. Just before finishing it, I would cover it with a little bit of remaining butter. And the oven has to be preheat to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and you put it in for 50 minutes, 55 minutes, until this looks, well, golden delicious, something around that. I will obviously show as it will be coming out of the oven. So the next step is baking it for 50 minutes and preparing the sauce, because the sauce, the syrup, has to be filled while it's hot. There are different ways of doing it. You can do it when it's cool, but then I found that in some cases it's not going to be as it won't basically absorb it as well. So I usually pour the syrup when it just comes out of the oven. Okay, so the next step is making the actual syrup, which is very simple. Okay, so this goes into the oven. So the next step is to make the syrup. As I said before, basically add water, sugar. The rose water or vanilla I usually add at the end. And we will turn it on to about medium heat. So the important part is that after everything dilutes and it actually reaches the boiling point, is to make sure that it doesn't boil over, and boils for about 10 minutes or so. So it's not so watery, I would say. And what I wanted to say also is that you can use different types of sugar, so maybe brown sugar, maybe more honey, add different spices, but that's on a level of how you want to experiment and want to try it out. I'm generally following the recipe because when I bring it over, I bring it for a large crowd, and this is what typically people are happy with, I would say. Okay, so I will continue boiling this until it will be ready for adding to our baklava. Now I have about 15 minutes left in baking for baklava, and what I've done is generally started. I usually start this about 15 minutes before baklava is ready, so bowls are hot for when you put them together. So it's been bubbling away for probably about 6-7 minutes, something like that, and we're about at the end of it, so I'll add about a teaspoon, maybe a bit much of, not more than that, of rose water. Let it get to the bubbling stage again. I probably can turn it off after that. So the next thing would be, in about 2-3 minutes, we're going to have our baklava ready out of the oven. It's been there, well, almost 50 minutes now, and I'll show you how you would pour the sauce and distribute in between, because I don't just pour it, I tilt the pan so it gets distributed all over the tray. Also collect so it doesn't. I think we're done with this one, so I'll turn off the burner, and next we'll be adding the syrup onto our baklava. So it's just out of the oven, and you can see they're sort of separated and baked through, and you get an idea of a color, so it's about brownish. Then what you do is you can either spoon it or slowly pour over each of the baklava rolls. So what I would do after this is poured, and you see it's basically almost like floating. Now you can increase the amount of syrup or decrease it as you like, and this is sort of like the medium amount. And then I grab it and I basically do this. I make sure it gets distributed all over and basically flows through the actual rolls to make sure there's good coverage. I would do this about 2 more times in, I would say, space of 5 minutes ish, and then I would let it sit until it gets to the room temperature, where we can either transfer it into a container that you're taking with you, or take it as is. Now, one thing I would say is that don't cover it, because one of the reasons I like not to cover it is to have a crunchy baklava, and if you cover it and it gets moistened, it will not be as crunchy. Now, some people like it not crunchy, and that's great, because then you can just put it in the freezer and keep it for, I would say, a few weeks, and it will work very well. But if not covered, it will probably keep fairly well for a few days. Not that it's going to last for a few days, because it's going to be eaten. But so that's sort of the way how I keep it. And I keep it well, not in the fridge, as I said, because I like the crunchiness of it. And that's basically it. I will take a picture of a cross section afterwards. So we are done. It's been about an hour, and I basically took just to take a picture of a cross section. You can put it into sort of muffin liners for serving, or just keep it in a tray. And inside it looks about that. I'll be able to focus properly. Obviously, you shouldn't be cutting it at all with a fork. You should be eating it, biting it, but that's how it is inside. It's fairly airy, so that's sort of the I guess why I like to make it into rolls instead of a flat approach, how quite a lot of recipes are, and probably the genuine ones. So the recipe is in the description below, both the link of the original recipe and what and how it was done here. So I guess this is my first sort of baking video. I'm not planning to make a lot of them, but this was requested, so I decided to make it to make people's life easier and show that this is actually not that difficult to make. Alright, well, I hope you make it as well and enjoy it. Bye.